Chapter 15, Section 2 is on financing government, and we're going to look at some definitional issues associated with taxation, and then we're going to look at taxation in terms of supply and demand diagram, and you're going to learn something very counterintuitive about taxes. Okay, first some definitional issues. When we talk about taxes, they can take three forms: regressive, progressive, or proportional. The difference between these three types of taxes, regressive, proportional, and progressive, has to do with how the tax rate varies with income. And so, what do we mean by tax rate? We're talking about taxes divided by income. So, taxes as a percentage of income. Notice in all these definitions you see the percentage of income is the major part. So in other words, the percentage of income is taxes paid over income. And I can illustrate these three terms graphically. Let's say we have the following diagram. On the x-axis we have income, and then we have on the y-axis tax as percent of income. And so the difference between these three types of taxes is that proportional looks like this. As your income goes up, you pay a higher tax rate. Regressive looks like this. As your income goes up, you pay a lower tax rate. And then proportional is the one where the tax rate you pay does not depend on income. So I know that this might look like a supply and demand diagram. It's totally different, right? Here you have income on the x-axis, not quantity. And here you have taxes as a percentage of income on the y-axis, not price. So this has absolutely nothing to do with supply and demand. I'm just trying to illustrate the differences. So the U.S. income tax system is proportional, like this green line. If you make less than, say, $25,000 a year, you don't pay any income tax. Certainly, you're going to pay taxes when you buy something, right? Sales taxes, or when you get a driver's license, you pay the registration fee. So you're going to pay taxes, you're going to contribute to government revenue, but you don't pay any income taxes. And so what I'm talking about here is that U.S. income taxes are progressive. But as your income goes up, your tax rate goes up, right? And so if you're making $50,000 a year, we'll have some data in a moment to show you what your tax rate will be. And if you're making $200,000 a year, your tax rate is even higher. So again, by rate, we're talking about what fraction of your income must you pay in taxes. Sometimes you hear proposals for a flat tax. For example, 15%. No matter what your income is, you pay 15%. If you're Bill Gates, you pay 15% income tax. If you're Matt Holian, you pay 15% income tax. This would be a proportional tax. There are also regressive taxes. And Social Security, in fact, is a regressive tax. Why? Well, in fact, it's proportional up to a certain level of income. But once your income is above a certain level, you don't have to pay Social Security tax on that anymore. So I don't have the data in front of me for what that is, but let's say for the sake of argument, it's $200,000 a year. And I forget the Social Security tax also, but let's say for argument it's 5%. So up to $200,000 a year, you have to pay 5% of your income to Social Security tax. But let's say you make $300,000 a year. Well then, you pay 5% on the first $200,000 you make, and then nothing on the last $100,000 that you make. So you're going to pay the same amount whether you make $200,000 or $300,000. But we're talking about taxes as a percent of income. And so if you pay the same amount, you're paying a lower tax rate at the higher income level, right? So that's why Social Security taxes are regressive. And this is definitional terms that you should be aware of, because you do hear them in debates about taxes, which are a very reoccurring theme in public discourse. Well, I was talking about what are the tax rates. I don't have the most current rates. These are from 2007, and they do change slightly from year to year. In 2007, if you made less than $24,300, you paid no income taxes. And in fact, you may receive earned income tax credit, which is, another word for that is a negative income tax. And another word for that is, it's like a welfare benefit, basically. So you might actually get paid, right? And the reason for this is, well, I won't go into all the reasons, but it's a way of encouraging people to work. If you make between $24,000 and $88,000, you paid 15%. Between 88 and 152, 25%, and so on, up to 35%. And so this is, as I was saying, income taxes in the US are progressive. Okay, I had promised that we're going to look at taxes in terms of a supply and demand diagram. And this is called tax incidence analysis. It will result in some very counterintuitive conclusions. So the book talks about taxes and uses something called a tax wedge to illustrate this. So here they refer to this $2 height as the tax wedge. But I want to give you a little background about where that comes from. So imagine the following situation. The government wants to levy a $2 tax per unit sold. And so we have the market for, in this case, beef, quantity on the x-axis, price on the y-axis. And for every pound of beef sold, there's going to be a $2 tax. Quite high, right? Maybe it's, okay, $2 per pound. So in any case, the government has to decide, how is it going to collect that tax? Is it going to make the buyers pay the $2 for every pound they buy? Or is it going to make the sellers pay the $2 for every pound they sell? Well, if they make the sellers pay for it, and this is, by the way, how sales taxes are collected, right? You walk into a store, you see that the beef is $5 a pound. And then you give the cashier $5. What are they going to say? They say, no, it's not $5, it's $5 plus tax. This might be a bad example because in many states, food is not subject to sales tax. So imagine something else, like a t-shirt. If the t-shirt is $5, you give the cashier $5 and say, no, it's not $5, it's actually $5.50 because there's 10% sales tax, right? So what's happening is, you're giving the cashier $5.50. They're putting, think about it conceptually this way. They're putting $5 in the cash register, and then they're putting 50 cents in some can, and that's going to, all the money in the can is going to go to the government at the end of the day. This means the tax is imposed on sellers. So how is this going to affect the market? Imagine before the tax is imposed, we have supply and demand as shown here. At a price of $3, which was the equilibrium price, firms are willing to supply 3 million pounds per day. But now, the sellers are required to send $2 to the government for every pound they sell. So if I give the seller $3, they have to give $2 of that to the government now. How much do they get to keep? $1. Are firms willing to supply 3 million pounds when the price is $1? No. How much are they willing to supply when the price is $1? We look at the supply curve and we see 1 million pounds. So if the price that we exchange the beef at is $3, sellers only get to keep $1 of that. Therefore, they're only willing to supply 1. Another way to say this is the supply curve shifts up by the amount of the tax. So the fact that the tax is imposed on sellers means the supply curve is shifting up. Again, if the price is $3, sellers are only willing to supply 1. So what's the new equilibrium price going to be when the curve shifts? It turns out it's going to be $4. And how much of this $4 do the sellers get to keep? Only $2. So the consumers are paying $4 for the beef. The sellers, which are required to pay the tax, give half of that to the government and keep $2 for themselves. In other words, $4 is the price buyers pay, and $2 is the price sellers receive. And then this amount here is what? Tax revenue. Right? This is all the money that the government raised as a result of this tax. So, what I want to show you, what's counterintuitive about this is, you might think that the sellers are going to bear all the burden of the tax, right? Because they're the one who actually has to pay it. But not true. Because buyers were paying $3, now they're paying $4. So buyers are worse off. Sellers are also worse off. They're only receiving $2, but that's only $1 less than they were receiving before. So this is an interesting result of our tax incidence analysis through the demand and supply diagram. We see that it doesn't matter who you put the tax on. You put it on sellers, you put it on buyers. The result's going to be the same no matter what. This is a very counterintuitive argument, or result, I should say, that people who haven't had principles of microeconomics don't understand. I'll also point out one other thing. There's a deadweight loss associated with taxation. Remember, we were consuming 3 units, and this was consumer surplus, and this was producer surplus. But now, what's the area of consumer surplus? I'll shade it in blue. So now this is consumer surplus, right? It's the area below the demand curve and above the price. The price that buyers are paying is $4. What's the producer surplus? It's the area below the price and above the supply curve. Well, sellers are receiving a price of $2. I know that the sticker price, if you will, is $4, but of that they're only keeping $2. So the producer surplus is this green triangle. Therefore, this red triangle is deadweight loss. Without the tax, if there was no tax, price would be $3. Consumer surplus would be this blue triangle. Producer surplus would be this green triangle. Right? So total surplus would be this whole area. But with the tax, we don't get this area at all. So that's why it's a deadweight loss. So that's another perhaps surprising result, is that taxes result in inefficiencies. Now, if the government needs to raise money, that might be a price that society has to pay. But it also means that collecting tax revenue is costly. And why is that the case? Well, here's the intuition for why that's a deadweight loss. This seller, the sellers here, who are currently producing 2 million pounds of beef, could produce more beef, and the marginal cost would be only between $2 and $3, right? And then there are consumers here who are willing to consume more beef, and they're willing to pay between $3 and $4. So they're willing to pay more than the cost of production. But they don't exchange. Why? Because they want to avoid paying the tax. So in order to avoid paying the tax, these individuals don't exchange. These exchanges, which would have led to more net benefits, never take place, and there's a deadweight loss. So before we move on, I want to illustrate how a tax imposed on buyers would work. So now, in this case, the buyers must pay the tax to the government. If the price is $3, then they effectively have to pay $5. Because they have to pay $3 to the sellers and then $2 to the government. But at a price of $5, consumers are only willing to pay 1 pound. So we can illustrate this as the demand falling. And it's going to shift down by the amount of the tax. So for example, if the price, the sticker price in the store is $1, consumers demand 3 million pounds, because they know they're going to have to pay $2 to the government. In other words, they know the effective price is $3. Right? So before, there was no difference between the sticker price and the effective price. But now that we have a tax, there is a difference. The sticker price is what the consumer pays to the store. The effective price is what the out-the-door price is, after they pay the store and the government. And so what quantity will be exchanged now? $2. this is the price sellers receive. But after the consumers give $2 to the store, they must give $2 to the government, and so $4 is the price buyers pay. Again, tax revenue is this area, consumer surplus is this area, producer surplus is this area, and this is deadweight loss. So I hope you understand the basics of tax incidence analysis. It might be confusing where these shifting curves come from, but that is important, I think, to go over so that you don't think that we're just pulling these things out of thin air. Now, another approach is to just use this tax wedge and say, okay, if the tax is $2, it's this distance, let's slide it in here, and this will determine the price sellers receive and the price buyers pay. That's an easier way to analyze taxes with a supply and demand diagram. I feel like I have to explain to you why this tax wedge, where it comes from, but if you're comfortable with that, you can simplify your life by just using this tax wedge. And the reason why it's useful is because not all markets have demand and supply curves that have the same elasticity, right? And so here we have 4 different markets where the relative price elasticities differ. So for example, here supply is elastic, but demand is inelastic. And so there's a relatively elastic supply. We can take a tax of this amount and figure out how the prices that the buyers pay and the price that sellers receive changes by inserting this tax wedge into our diagram. And so we see that what happens to the price that sellers receive? Does it fall by a lot or a little? Only a little. The sellers were receiving P1, now they're receiving a little bit less than it. Maybe P0. But what about buyers? Well, they're paying a lot more because they were paying P1, but now they're paying P2. And so here we say that the buyers bear the burden of the tax. Why does this matter? Well, sometimes governments try to impose taxes on buyers or sellers because they think that one group is more able to pay the tax. And so sometime a few years ago, there was a proposal to, I think in fact it was imposed, a tax on sailboat sales. Why? Because who buys sailboats? Rich people. So they are able to handle the tax, right? But let's analyze the situation using tax incidence analysis. What's the demand? Is the demand for sailboats elastic or inelastic? If the price of sailboats goes up, do the rich people say, well, I simply must have a sailboat? Or maybe they buy a yacht instead, a motorboat. Or maybe they do something else with their money. Maybe they buy a luxury home, or who knows, right? It's not a necessity, so the demand for sailboats is probably elastic. What about the supply of sailboats? If you're a sailboat manufacturer and the price falls, is it easy for you to switch into some other line of production? Probably not. There are not that many things that are similar to producing sailboats. So if the demand for sailboats is elastic and the supply of sailboats is inelastic, which of these 4 figures are we in? Here we have relatively elastic demand. And who's going to bear the burden of the tax in this situation? Well, take our tax, insert it in, and we figure out that P2 is the price buyers pay, and P0 is the price sellers receive. The price that sellers receive goes down a lot, although buyers are only paying a little bit more. So if the goal of the tax is to raise revenue from rich people, it's not working here. Because who's really harmed? Well, both parties are harmed, But the sellers are the ones who are really harmed. They're receiving a lot less. And are the producers of sailboats rich? Maybe not. Right? These could be blue-collar workers who, for example, are not rich. And so this is a counterintuitive result from tax incidence analysis. It doesn't matter who the tax is imposed on. The only thing that matters in answer to the question of who bears the burden of the tax is what are the relative elasticities of supply and demand.